Okay, so this is greeter development for May 4th, which I believe is Star Trek Day 2018. Coding live stream. So I'm going to pick up where I left off last night with I've got a test for the /ping route, so I can see that the /ping route works the way that I want it to, which is actually part of the login test. And then the other thing I want to test, which is also part of the login functionality, is that anything under the /API route or anything under the /API directory requires a login. So that's what I'm going to implement. But I'm not going to write a test for that. I'm not going to write a test for everything under the API route, because that would be a lot of tests. If we were doing property-based testing, like with QuickCheck or Hypothesis, or like what we would do when I get around to writing the testing library for GlobalScript, then we would want to actually go ahead and do something like that. Do some kind of test that, okay, everything under the API directory requires a login. But for unit testing, what you do is you test that one thing under the API directory requires a login. And that couples you a little bit to that route. So we want to pick a route which is sort of there just to be there, maybe something that's a little bit related to login. So what I'm going to do is, to test this, is set up and I just realized that what I can actually do is maybe use a nonsense route and test that you get a 403 or that you get a 404. You get a 403 without a login and you get a 404 with a login. But let me go ahead and verify. Let's go ahead and start this and see how this works. And then if that works, we can switch over to a nonsense route. And that'll work better, because we're basically just testing at that point that, okay, every route, including the routes that we didn't define, does require a valid session. So this is a little bit of an unusual design decision to require a cookie on a modern web application. There's a couple of reasons for doing it this way. One reason is just familiarity. I'm making a lot of decisions here on the basis of this is what I'm used to, this is what I'm comfortable with. And another reason for doing it this way is I've seen and I've read a lot online about storing credentials properly and storing how do you prove to the server that you're working and how do you add it to every request, and setting a cookie and making sure that the cookie is HTTP only and so on and so forth. Sounds simpler to me than trying to send a token back that the client side can actually use. Where that breaks down is when you have enough simultaneous sessions that you have enough web servers and you're getting to the session store is starting to be a source of contention. And for Greeter, you have basically one simultaneous session, so that's not really an issue. So I'm going to go with the cookie for now. Store session server side. You absolutely have to maintain, you have to do your security checking on the server. You have to do your session expiration on the server. All of the logic, all of the functionality for sessions has to live on the server, because you can send, obviously for Greeter is open source, but you can write a proprietary application and you can send obfuscated JavaScript or minimized JavaScript or whatever you want to call it to the client. And a lot of people do obfuscate their JavaScript. They'll do all kinds of weird crap to try to stop you from being able to figure out what the original JavaScript code was. But people will do that, and you can do it. But anybody who's running your app in a browser can see, I mean, the browser will tell them the network connections that are being made. The browser will give them the cookie contents. And so if you're trying to depend on the client or trust the client to tell you if it's authorized, or trust the client to tell you what its user type is or what permissions it has, that's going to get hacked. So you have to do your security on the server. And my bag is really simplicity. So I've got a very simple session store that just has a database ID. I've got a user object. I'm probably not going to stick a ton of unnecessary business logic that's not database related on the user object. But if I need to build permissions or anything like that, I could build permission systems that work alongside the user object or user result set, whatever it is. That's kind of a digression, but that's actually a really good idea, is to write a function that takes a user result set and returns a user result set that's filtered to just users that have a particular permission. And then you can turn a result back into a result set that returns that one row, hand it to the filtering function, and then call count on the resulting result set, and the result of count will tell you whether the user has the permission or not. This user has that particular permission or not. And then if you want to select users who do have a particular permission, you can also do that. So just a little thing to think about. I'm pretty gung-ho about Devik. I think it's a pretty powerful system that people probably don't use as effectively as they could. Some people don't use as effectively as they could. So, at the moment, we've got our test, and at the moment it's failing because we're getting a 404 because there is no API user route anywhere in the system. So, we want to apply some logic to all API routes. And then we want to do want to control when you're doing a search like this in MetaCPAN from this bar, it's better to type in the exact package name if you know it, because MetaCPAN search will take you to the right place quicker. And then wildcard ***. Okay, so we want to handle any route and what we're going to do to start out with is just say any route under the API directory. Pass in Dancer means go to the next handler that matches this route. So keep processing this request. And as we can see, that produces a 404 because there is no request. So then we can look up the user in the session. And say if the user is in the session, then keep going. And if the user is not in this session, I'm going to stick in a die because it's really easy to observe whether a die actually runs. So I'm a big fan of debug by printf statement. I'm a big fan of debug by warn. And if you're just, well, pretty much if you can edit the code and rerun a request and nobody else is using the copy of the code you're changing, I'm a big fan of debug by die statement. Because it is real visible. All right. So, requires login. Ah, okay. So our first So I'm going to cut and paste this code. If you know anything about, I think I don't need an else clause here because pass will actually, it'll jump out of the current route handler, but I'm not completely sure. Okay. So I'm going to cut and paste this code. People will tell you, don't ever cut and paste code. Strictly speaking, you don't want to listen to somebody who says don't, well, you don't want to listen to somebody who says don't ever in programming ever, right? Because they just, if they're going to say don't ever, they just don't know what they're talking about, honestly. But specifically, if somebody says don't ever cut, well, somebody says don't ever cut and paste, again, don't listen to them. Because what you're going to end up doing is, I want this line of code, that line of code is in that function over there, and you're going to end up calling that function over there that has the line of code in it. And then you're going to need to change the function you called. You have functions that serve two masters, and you're going to change a function to make it do the right thing for one use case, and now it's going to do the wrong thing for another use case. And it's just going to turn into a mess. You're going to have tons of if statements. You're going to have, basically, because you've got two different functions and you're trying to interleave the code for two different functions. And it's really not going to work well. So you want to think about, why is there a duplication? Is there some way that I can remove this duplication that will be semantic and that will be functional? So one thing you could do is, if you are implementing the same business decision in multiple places, you want to pull that out. Technically, I'm probably breaking that rule by returning the status unauthorized everywhere, status forbidden and status unauthorized. Well, no, I'm going to say that I'm not, because I'm going to say that it's really a separate business decision. What does /ping do? What does /API do? That's a little bit arguable. The actual dancer status forbidden, right, actually returning a 403, that's more of an overall technical decision that we've made, that we're going to return a 403 anytime there's a problem with the cookie, problem with the session. And then we're going to put the status unauthorized. I could write a function that wraps up just the status forbidden line and call it here. Or even, I think Dancer has got, Dancer used to have special Dancer used to have special functions for returning a status and setting a status and returning a result. I've seen them before. I don't remember exactly. Let's see. Returns an H. Yeah, send error. So send error has the. That is. Send error has the arguments in the wrong order. So we could use that. We could call it, wrap it in a function, to say, you know, send permission error, whatever. It's probably not worth it for only 2 places in the code. So now I'm seriously considering whether I should do this. The other thing you want to pay attention to is a little bit of code duplication is okay if you can cut and paste 2 lines of code in 2 places, and you're not if you can cut and paste the 2 lines of code in 2 places and it saves you a 5-line function or whatever, if it cuts down the total number of lines of code, that's probably a good trade-off. What you want to watch is, okay, how many places has this piece of code been duplicated to? One of the reasons I think corporate code bases get so bad is that there's nobody in the company who has an overall view of the entire code base. Which is partly because managers don't read the code that their subordinates are writing, and there's no real architect. There's nobody who has an overall view. And so nobody really notices when this is the third time that we've cut and pasted these 2 lines of code, or the 5th time, or the 10th time, or the 100th time. But for an open source project like this with one developer, I'm going to say that it's okay to go ahead and go ahead and do this. Cut and paste 2 lines of code. What we don't want to do is take these 2 lines of code and move them to a separate function without seriously considering what the specification is for that function. Every function should have one of 2 kinds of specifications. Either you want to have a specification that says I see, I got it. Either you want to have a specification that says this piece of code does this thing. Right, so you have a detailed, here are the inputs, here are the outputs, and then you never change the output of that function because that would change or break the specification. You never want to change the specification of an existing function. You always want to write a new function with a new specification and then refactor, but keeping the specification of the old function in place. So either your specification is the behavior that the function has. So you could have a sort function. Specification is it sorts the input, sorts the list. You could have, you know, a Gaussian transform function or something. I don't know. Or the specification is it implements this particular business decision. It implements either a single business decision, like I said, or it implements how we want this process to work. This implements how we want. So the next thing I'm working on is, let's see if I can actually pull this up. Cannot be reached. Okay, the web server is not actually running, so let's start it real quick. Okay. The unit tests don't run the web server, they run something else. Okay, so the process is you go to Greeter, you're a member. It's not going to look like this, but I turned off the CSS because I read somewhere that if the code is not finished, if the code is under construction, the application should look like it's under construction. So I've got most of the all of the CSS basically turned off. And you're getting a not in our database because the API says that if I try to look up a member by phone number who's not in the database, you get a 404 back. And you're getting a 404 because the route doesn't exist, right? There is no API member route. So we're trying to implement, we need to implement this API member route, which specifies how this member lookup process works. What happens, basically what happens when I click on check-in. So there's a function on the front end that directly specifies or implements what happens when I click on check-in. And its job, its specification, is to do the thing that check-in should do. And so I can change its behavior as long as it's still implementing the check-in button, because that's still the specification. And then on the back end, I've got a route whose job is to look up a member when that member begins the check-in process. And its specification is it does this part of this business process. As far as possible, you really, really want these functions that have a business specification process, you want the thing that they implement to have a name that your user understands. And then if a function doesn't have a name that your user understands, you probably want to treat it, rather than what I call a feature function, which implements a piece of business logic, you probably want to treat it as what I call a functional function, functional piece of code, that always does the same thing. And then if your business process changes, you don't change, your business logic changes, you don't change a functional piece of code to do something different. You change the feature code to call a different function, a different piece of functional code. And so you don't call one feature from another unless, from the user's perspective, one feature includes or uses another feature. And so then the user may not know the internal names that the programmer uses, but there should be a name the programmer can use to refer to that feature when talking to the user, or a term that the user can say, oh yeah, I know what that is. Here's what that should do. Here's how that should work. So you want to sort of segregate the code like that. So we've got code now, it looks like, that will take anything in the API directory, check for a valid user, and then if it doesn't find a valid user, it will say if it doesn't find a valid user, it will return an error message. Okay, normally okay, here's what I'm going to do, because I really strongly believe that this with login function should be written inside the T file. I should get the test working with the with login function inside the T file, and then I should factor it out to another module. It needs to go to another module. But not immediately. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have the with login function use the global variables $set and $params from the login.t file. And then I'm going to have, then when I factor it out, moving it to a separate module will also require adding those parameters, which is a general rule when you're refactoring. It's a let lambda rule. So you have let x equals e0 in let f equals e1, where e1 uses x, in e2, where e2 uses f, right? And then you want to move f to a higher scope, to a larger scope than x. What you have to do is you have to say let f of x equals e1 of x in let x equals e0 in e2, and then in e2 you have to replace f with f of x. So anytime you're moving a function definition or a lambda past an outer let, past the scope of a variable that function is closing over. You may not think of a function as closing over the global variables defined in that module, but that's actually how it works. It's actually what it's doing. Anytime you're refactoring and you move a function up in scope past the definition of a variable it uses, you have to make that variable a parameter to the function, and then find all the calls and start passing that variable in. So and I'm going to do more cut and pasting here. You want to be careful refactoring. You don't want to couple your test to your code too much, but you want to be careful when you're refactoring your tests. Tests should be utterly, completely straightforward. And if you're going to call a function from your test, that function should really have tests of its own. So I'm going to change this to I'm putting spaces at the end just so the die message will not end with a new line, because dumper ends with a new line. Dumper ends with a new line. So then I want to do a login. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this in a try, and I'm going to say rep such new. Okay. Not test user, test login. New. I'm going to wrap this in a try-catch finally. This doesn't do anything except maybe slow the code down a little bit. No, I'm not going to do this. I need to remember to come back later and add explicit logout support. It's not super important right now, especially because right now all we're implementing is the stuff that's going to be used from the tablet. And the tablet is essentially never going to be logged out. If the tablet is logged in, it'll be kept next to logged out. It'll be kept next to the password. The tablet's just going to stay at the greeter's desk, and it's going to basically be logged in all the time. So I'm not terribly worried about not terribly worried about that. So I wanted to create this $rec variable. And I'm really debating in my mind whether with login should actually create its own $set variable or not. I'm not gonna do it that way now, but I reserve the right to change my mind. But I wanted to have this $rec that acts more like it's a wrapper for $sets. So if you're not familiar with this, by the way, this is Plaque test. So you give it a Plaque application, Perl web application, and it returns this Plaque test variable acts like an LWP, so it acts like an HTTP client's object. And when you call request on it, it actually goes and does the request in your application. So my application is running inline in the same Perl process, but other than that, I'm creating an HTTP request and then going through all the dancer code to decode the request and everything. It's particularly useful for something like Dancer, where how else am I going to find these functions to call them, right? And so I need this class. Moops is pretty much by far the best way to create classes in Perl. So I'm just going to go ahead and use Moops at the end of the test file, write a class, and then when I go to factor this out, I will use Moops for that whole module and just put two packages in it, one that's a namespace that has an exporter and blah, 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 and then one that has one that's this wrapped sut business. I'll still just put it inline in the same file because it's, as you'll see, it's completely trivial. So I have method request, I have by observation, I have a request, and I have some parameters which I can worry about. And basically all I want to do is go to self-jar. So I've got a cookie jar which stores the cookies, and then apparently, this is a Perl thing, apparently the cookie jar has the logic for pulling cookies off of a request and pulling cookies off a response, HTTP response, and pushing them onto a request. Which to some extent makes sense because of course cookies are just headers. So all extract cookies is really doing is saying, okay, you know, an LWP response or an HTTP response already knows how to enumerate the headers, how to look for the values of specific headers. That's all I'm doing. I'm looking for the values of the cookie headers and extracting them into a cookie jar, storing them into a cookie jar. Hello? Yes, sir. Can you hang on for just a sec? I am live streaming. Okay, I just got a phone call from a recruiter, so I'm going to kill the live stream if I can find my mouse pointer.